Okay, so starting with list the main eras in the Western philosophy tradition. So here it is. The main eras in Western philosophy are ancient, medieval, modern, and contemporary. And there's overlap between the different eras, and the eras are largely time and content based. Like you see, I've put rough times for these eras. And the ancient era took place around a certain time and had certain emphases, but there aren't many strict, bright lines, either in time or content, that set the boundaries in these eras. So we might say that ancient philosophy had a focus on metaphysics and modern philosophy had a focus on epistemology, but there were ancient philosophers inquiring into epistemology and modern philosophers inquiring into metaphysics. And it's more accurate to say that the ancient era kind of set the agenda or established the main items in the conversation, and the following eras responded to what came before. But this basic organization of ancient, medieval, modern, contemporary, that's how Western philosophy is conventionally studied and understood. Now, some people will just say, count contemporary as part of modern. So they'll just say, oh, it's kind of three: ancient, medieval, modern. There's some argument to kind of separate contemporary from modern, and likely in 100 years we'll have some other organization, but this is kind of how it's organized now. And I'm just going to touch briefly on each of these eras at a superficial level. Our focus is just to know, here's what the main eras are in kind of very broad strokes. So the ancient era, and I know I just said that there aren't many bright lines, but the arrival of Socrates is one of those bright lines that sets a boundary. So we call philosophers before Socrates pre-Socratics, because Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, Plato was a student of Socrates and Aristotle was a student of Plato, these would change philosophy forever. These would, as I mentioned before, they would kind of set the conversation for everything that happened afterwards. And while Socrates gets the honor of having his name in that boundary line, it's really Plato and Aristotle who will forever shape the questions, the approaches, and the frameworks, and in general, the conversation of philosophy after. They'll each introduce these systematic frameworks that would encompass the major branches of philosophy and then some. Some prominent philosophers will say that everything after Plato and Aristotle are just footnotes to Plato and Aristotle. Okay, and then the medieval era is dominated by the Catholic Church, and in a lot of ways, it's interpreting Catholicism through the lens of ancient philosophy, and especially through the lens of Plato or Aristotle. And this figure here, this is Aquinas, and I'm listing a couple philosophers here. Aquinas, we have a course on Aquinas. Augustine is another prominent medieval philosopher. I'm not putting here, and I'm not suggesting these are the two most important philosophers in the medieval era, though there could be a case for those two as the most important in the medieval era. But I'm really just trying to say, here's a sample. Here are a couple philosophers from the medieval era. And then the modern era is a shift away from theology toward reason. And here's an example of where the boundaries kind of blur. Like Aquinas was also clearly shifting away from theology toward reason, or kind of incorporating reason into his theology. But the modern era is this more dramatic shift away from theology, away from doctrine, Catholic doctrine, to reason. And if in the beginning of the Middle Era, doctrine and scripture were how we know, the modern era would take a close look at epistemology. And epistemology is just how we gain. It's a branch in philosophy that's concerned with how we gain or justify knowledge. And the modern era would kind of take epistemology to its end. The modern era would present two opposing schools for epistemology: rationalism, and their main argument is that reason, deductive reasoning, is the source of knowledge, and empiricism, and that branch would say that sense experience is the source of knowledge. And then the era would culminate in Kant's transcendental idealism, which you don't need to know that term for this course. But Kant will kind of synthesize rationalism and empiricism. And this is, the image here is Kant. And then I kind of think of the contemporary era as after Kant. And this extends from the end of the 18th century to now. I don't think Kant, like we don't say pre-Kantian and post-Kantian like we do pre-Socratics. So Kant doesn't paint as bright a boundary as Socrates, but he's definitely a major force. And again, I'm listing philosophers here that Newlane has courses for. And while these three are important philosophers from this era, this isn't the most important, not necessarily the most important philosophers from this era. And the contemporary era presents movements that may feel like the kind of esoteric academic movements in philosophy, like postmodernism, existentialism, structuralism, post-structuralism, pragmatism, deconstructionism, probably the kinds of things that Professor Wood would be more comfortable talking about than I would. But anyway, so that's the contemporary, that's a broad stroke on the contemporary era. And just to review, the main eras are ancient, medieval, modern, contemporary. And if you have those eras in mind and can name one or two philosophers from each era, what we want, the reason for this objective, list the main eras, is just for you to have a couple footholds as you study philosophy. So you can kind of go, okay, I'm reading this philosopher, this is a medieval philosopher, and here were kind of the concerns or the direction they were going during that